The greatest expression of the Communist International in the United States was, of course, the Communist Party USA. So you can erase that and start writing again. The Communist Party of the United States was formed, and it was the American wing of the Communist International. So the CPUSA, I think there's members of that party in this room, right? And I think all of us in this room, while we may not be a member of that party's current incarnation, all of us consider that to be our heritage. That's who we come from. We are the inheritors of that country, of that party's legacy. The Center for Political Innovation maintains that party's history. Different organizations, you know, whatever, but this is who we come from. This is us. This is us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, when the Great Depression happened, the Communist Party formed unemployment councils. And it was organizations of hungry people who were unemployed, and they would go and protest, demanding the right to eat. And they would break into government buildings and demand that elected officials give work or wages now. And they had huge hunger marches in Washington, D.C., huge hunger marches in major cities. 1932, in Detroit, near the mansion of Henry Ford, communists assembled and were mowed down by security guards and killed, protesting for the rights of the unemployed. You also had the Bonus Army. And that was the Communist Party organized veterans to demand the payment of veterans' benefits and occupy Washington, D.C., set up tents on the National Mall. And the military was eventually called in to clear them out. And it was the very famous incident in 1931.
Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. Take it from me. This is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had.
It's war, the greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865. And so they're being forced out of their shacks by smoke bombs and tear gas, hurled by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States. The orders of the President must be obeyed. And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic Bonus Army. In the shadow of the beautiful dome of the Capitol of the United States of America.
Now, because the Social Democrats were not allowing the Communists to be part of the American Federation of Labor, they formed their own labor coalition called the Trade Union Unity League, the TUUL. With the TUUL, they were able to organize the unorganized. They organized coal miners. They organized sharecroppers in the South, textile workers. These were communist unions. You know, the TUUL, there were 10 points of unity for the Trade Union Unity League. One of the points was defense of the Soviet Union, and another point was the establishment of socialism in the United States. These were communist-controlled unions. In 1934, you had the strike wave. So in 1934, the summer of 1934, the Great Depression is on. Roosevelt is president. And in San Francisco, the dock workers went on strike. And previously, when the dock workers would go on strike, the dock workers had a racist union that was whites only. And so when the dock workers would go on strike, the white dock workers would go on strike, black workers would be hired as replacement labor, and that was that. But it was different because the Communist Party was anti-racist. And the Communist Party went to the black churches, and it went to the black community, and it said, one of the demands of our strike is going to be the hiring of black workers on the docks. And so in 1934, when Samuel Darcy, some other leaders of the Communist Party, they called the 1934 strike. And when that happened, the black community supported it and mobilized to support it. And the Teamsters supported it. And they shut down the docks of San Francisco. And that's a huge part of the imports to the United States. Ships were not being unloaded. And it caused a national crisis. And ultimately, the bosses were forced to surrender and recognize the International Longshore Warehouse Union, the ILWU, which is still today one of the most radical unions in the country, created by the Communist Party. Yeah, with their anti-racist policy, because they got away from the whites-only policy. Now, also that summer, you had the Minneapolis Teamster strike, right? A broken clock is right twice a day. The Trotskyites did one good thing, and they did the 1934 Teamster strike, and they shut down Minneapolis, right? Yeah, so there you go. And also, in addition to that, you had in Toledo, Ohio, you had the Auto Light strike that was members of a group called the Workers' Party of America, as well as the Communist Party USA. They shut down Toledo, Ohio. In the summer of 1934, they declared a national state of emergency in the state of South Carolina because the textile strike was going on and the sharecroppers were on strike as well, and the National Guard was called out in South Carolina. So it was a summer of chaos in 1934, and the country was on edge of revolt. Roosevelt was very much fearing a military coup against him, and he needed to have folks support. He needed to calm people down. So in 1935, you can write this down, 1935, they passed the Wagner Act, which legalized labor unions. So it's really because of the hard work the Communist Party did that the labor unions are even legal in this country. Yeah. So they passed the Wagner Act in 1935, and the Wagner Act made it legal to be a member of a union. And the AFL was the main labor federation. But the AFL did not want to organize industrial workers, right? They had this policy. They only organized skilled workers. They were very reluctant to organize industrial workers. But there was a man who was a member of the AFL, John L. Lewis, leader of the miners' union. And John L. Lewis, 1936, he was at a convention of the AFL, and he was arguing that they should organize industrial workers, and the head of the carpenters' union did not agree with him and insulted him, called him a nasty name, so he punched him in the face. And then he led the CIO, the Congress for Industrial Organizations, to walk out of the AFL convention and form a new labor coalition called the CIO. But what made the CIO different than the AFL was first that they wanted to organize industrial workers. Second, though, they had no ban on communists, and they hired almost exclusively Communist Party organizers to organize the CIO. So you can write 1936 CIO. And the CIO, the Congress for Industrial Organizations, it had no ban on communists, and they, starting in Akron, Ohio, started a policy of engaging in what they called sit-down strikes. Normally when there's a strike, workers are outside with signs, etc. Well, the CIO had a different policy, and they occupied the factories. They sat down. They seized the machinery. It was a sit-down strike. And the most famous sit-down strike started in late December of 1936 to 1937. It was the Flint sit-down strike. And John L. Lewis, these workers in this plant, this auto plant, had seized their factory. And the National Guard was assembling, and the military was there, and the police were there. And workers from all over the country drove to Flint, Michigan to support the sit-down strikers and to support them. And John L. Lewis, who had punched the head of the Carpenters Union recently, he showed up at the factory and he ripped his shirt open. He said, "If they're going to shoot anybody, they're going to shoot me," right? And thousands of people poured into Flint, Michigan to support it. And ultimately, the military was sent in by Roosevelt, and people were shocked when they saw that the machine guns were pointed away from the factory. The machine guns were there to support the workers. And the Roosevelt administration argued that workers had the right to occupy their factories, right? At this point, there was a divide in the ruling class, and Roosevelt was under attack from the threat of fascism, so that forced him to enter a strategic alliance with the working class, right? This is how the contradictions work. This is what Marx wrote about in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. When the capitalists are fighting with each other, it creates an opening for the workers. So 1936, you had the sit-down strike wave, right? Now, at this point, I think you can erase this. The most important contribution, and we should make no bones about this, the most important contribution of the Communist Party to the United States, by far, is their efforts to combat racism. The impact of the Communist Party of the United States in fighting racism and forcing the issue of racism to be in the discussion in the United States is massive. This is William L. Patterson. Yeah. 1951. He wrote a document called "We Charge Genocide," accusing the U.S. government of committing genocide against black people in the United States. He wrote that document, and the Soviet Union presented it to the United Nations. It's utterly amazing. The Scottsboro 9. Have people heard of the Scottsboro case? Yeah. Yes. Another great example. Do people know who this is? This is Angelo Herndon. Angelo Herndon was a black organizer for the Communist Party in Alabama. He was organizing unemployment relief, black workers and white workers to fight for their rights. And they charged him with the crime of inciting black insurrection. And they sentenced him to death. That was a death penalty offense. As he was sentenced to death, he was facing the electric chair for passing out leaflets, right? Because inciting black insurrection. So all across the country and all across the world, people organized to support Angelo Herndon. And finally, in 1937, the Supreme Court freed him. And they freed him. And Angelo Herndon he was facing death for organizing, but he wrote a very, very beautiful pamphlet called "You Cannot Kill the Working Class." about the struggle to free him and how he became a communist. And there's a beautiful section from it that I would like us to read as a group.